So,
Right.
howdy everyone. Let's start. Let's kick this off. We are going to talk about, what are we going to talk about? Platforms in Kubernetes, launching Shipa Cloud. And that will probably be in first couple of minutes, and then we're going to go off topic if history is right. So welcome everybody. My name is Viktor. I just joined Shipa Cloud as a developer advocate, something like that. And we have Bruno Andrade, which is, I don't know, CEO of Shippa. Is that what you are?
I just host. I just have the Costco card. That's what I do.
And there is a person that I feel that if I introduce him, then it would be silly because everybody knows him, and that's Kelsey Hightower. You want to say something? Who are you, Kelsey?
Kelsey, I've been learning Kubernetes for 7 years. I feel like I'll never be done. And also just, you know me as a developer advocate over at Google, but I'm also, like many of you all come from the same type of background, system administration, software development.
Do you still do the Kubernetes the hard way, or not anymore these days?
I update it once or twice a year. And now with the 121 release, I actually was scrolling through the release notes for the new release of Kubernetes. And I said, hey, go check out Kubernetes the hard way by Kelsey Hightower. I'm like, oh, I should update this now to be. So I'm in the middle of updating it. So hopefully I'll add some diagrams at some point. That's been a big ask. People want diagrams to know where they are. So I'll probably be adding diagrams to it.
Nice.
But a better question is, when you are creating your own clusters, are you doing it the hard way still?
No, Kelsey does not do it the hard way. I think the hard way is probably not necessarily the best way because I think we're in distro territory, but I'm glad I know how to do it the hard way so I can appreciate the other ways.
That's right. Go GKE. Go GKE autopilot is easier, you would say.
Autopilot, yeah. Okay, so quick notes about what we're going to talk about. This is a launch of Shipa Cloud, and we're going to cover a few topics, at least initially. We're going to talk about, I don't see my own screen. The state of Kubernetes, I will look mostly from Kelsey on input. How do you see the state of Kubernetes today? What it is, and especially where it's going. And a lot about developer experience. How do developers experience Kubernetes? What is missing? What we might be contributing to it, and so on and so forth. And a bit about controls and governance, which tends to be a hot topic, not hot topic, but a painful topic very often. And then we will go through some demos in the meantime, and in between all those, Q&A, especially Q&A. I expect a lot of you to start asking questions right away, because the more we can do it bi-directional, interact with you guys, all of you, the better. Otherwise, it gets boring very quickly. So let's kick this off with, there we go, with a question to Kelsey. What are the gaps? What are the problems in Kubernetes today? And if you say there are no problems, I'm going to freak out.
Oh, yeah. I definitely won't be saying there are no problems, but I think where we are in 2021, it's always good to kind of look back and also look where we are. Credit to things like Amazon's Fargate, this concept of using Kubernetes style APIs to deploy applications, but then hiding some of the cluster. Then shout out to the GKE team, right? We shipped a thing called GKE Autopilot. And I remember the biggest North Star there was can we make the nodes disappear? And so for those that are familiar with Kubernetes, there's a control plane, API server, scheduler. There's a whole bunch of nodes as well. And I think when people see the nodes, they immediately go back to thinking about managing classic infrastructure, right? Provisioning the node, installing a bunch of agents. And so now we're at the point now where the nodes are going away. There's now offerings out there where the cluster has now disappeared. But the truth is the Kubernetes API still remains. So I think for your typical developer that's like had an ops team or is using GKE or AKS or EKS, any of those, that probably wasn't your biggest problem, let's be honest. Maybe for a platform team, provisioning and manage a cluster was, but for a developer, Probably not. Your biggest problem has probably been how to configure your workload, deployment objects, service, ingress, network policy, disruption budgets. Some of y'all don't even know what disruption budgets are, but it's a thing. And so once you start to add in all of those configuration objects, I think most developers are like overwhelmed by like, how do I manage all these objects times n number of services I'm responsible for? And so even though the cluster has gone away, that particular challenge remains.
But is it, should developers even care about those things? I mean, when I speak with people, it's over and over again. Yes, Kubernetes is great and all that stuff, but I don't have a year to learn it, right? And I still have that idea that developers really want just their code to run somewhere.
Yeah, I mean, I guess we have to be careful about when we say developers. Like, should the developer know how TCP/IP works? Probably. I mean, maybe not. I mean, I guess you could just use your library and, you know, make calls and hopefully everything works in between you and the next app. That's cool. Hopefully you never have to troubleshoot networking issues, because if you ever did, it might be good to know how those works. But I think what you're saying is like, on a daily basis, do you really need to understand all, you know, 7 layers of the stack? Probably not. And so I think that's where we are with Kubernetes. But to me, though, I think one thing that's fair, if you are a developer and you use MongoDB or Postgres or MySQL, you do need to understand the config file though, right? Like if you create a database and you have to tune the database, then you might want to know what goes into a MySQL or Postgres config file. Now, if you have a DBA, maybe they'll do it for you and all you have is credentials to the database, and then maybe your responsibility is performance, right? As my queries performant. So I think when we think about platform developers, I would also group them into this developer category. These are people that are building infrastructure tools and platforms themselves. So for them, they need to know all of these config files because that's how they tune and operate the system. Doesn't mean they need to learn how to build a scheduler from scratch, right? Like there's separation there. Now, on the other side, I think most developers though, wish they had just a deploy target, right? Here's my app. Here's the subset of data that I want to tell you. Like, do I really need to give you 500 YAML fields? Like, I don't think that's accurate. So this is where things like Helm come out, where they try to simplify configuration. And then Helm becomes its own challenge by itself just to manage Helm. But then I think most people are kind of looking for a platform. I think I have a tweet that says, I think everyone wants a platform. The only requirement is that they have to build it themselves. And that just speaks to kind of like everyone has their own workflow. And yet there hasn't been a platform flexible enough to articulate all their workloads.
And that's an interesting point on that topic of the developer having to learn or not. A few weeks ago, I was talking to a guy on the DevOps, because you usually have the kind of the operating person saying, no, developers, they should learn and all. And you have that kind of that battle between them. And the DevOps person at that telco company, he raised an interesting point. He was like, yeah, I think the developer kind of knowing what's happening, it's great. But honestly, I think pushing the developer to have to know how to create things from scratch, all the Helm chart and the objects and the manifests, it's tough, because at the end of the day, I know a lot of people say they should learn, but I don't spend my weekends learning Java so I can troubleshoot the application for the developer when there's a problem. So it's unfair for me to say they have to know everything from scratch and they have to know how to do that, everything by hand. So I thought it was nice and a good analogy, right? Knowledge is power, but on a day-to-day basis, if you have to take care of doing and managing all these things, it becomes cumbersome, right?
And the truth is, that's not even natural the way we think about adopting technology. Usually when someone figures something out, we tend to put a layer of abstraction or automation on top. So I think it's just early for Kubernetes that everyone's kind of learning at the same time. But just like Linux is abstracted away from a lot of people, I really think that most people push back because they know over time there should be higher level abstractions that give me sane defaults.
I agree.
Is that also a kind of sign of maturity, right? When technology comes along, everybody wants to learn details because it's really, there are no layers, mature layers on top of it that would abstract it. Like, when Java appeared, everybody was freaking out about learning JVM. Now, most Java developers do not really understand what's going on inside and just use it.
Yeah, just take all the memory on the box, right? Like just deploy your app. If you see a terabyte of RAM, just suck it all in. It'll be all right. Create another VM. It'll be okay. But I'm hoping we get in that today. Like when we, we're going to deep dive over the product today. And I want to make sure at least I start asking a bunch of questions around, is this now the revival of the past? Is the past now extendable? Are there enough flexibility yet conveniences to make all of this make sense? So I'm hoping that's what we kind of learned from today, is like poking around and seeing, are we there yet?
And it's an interesting point, because one of the things we learned talking to many companies is that, especially enterprise, there's a lot of talk about Kubernetes. People talk a lot about Kubernetes, but at least from our learning perspective, is that many enterprises, they are just at the beginning of their journey, right? You see the cloud, I would say cloud forward companies, they have built very advanced stuff. They are advancing their journey. But enterprises are one at the very beginning of their journey, and they start deploying the first few set of services. It looks fine, but as soon as they start kind of scaling to dozens or hundreds or thousands of services with hundreds of developers, then that's where things start getting complicated. And then the PaaS conversation comes, but I think people have kind of been hurt by the word PaaS, that kind of imposes something very opinionated on what you can use, one vendor only, how you can use things, and you have no choice of choosing components and things. So I think there's some kind of some hurt feelings from the past in terms of, I use a PaaS, and we see some companies getting into the build your own PaaS, but reality is most enterprises, that's not their core business. So they spend 1 year building it and they just dump it later and try to find something else.
Yeah, and I think a lot has to do with the fact that you probably won't have one PaaS. People are afraid to embrace that reality. There's this idea that you're going to find the perfect PaaS, and all the decisions you made 20 years prior will somehow be retrofitted to run in this new PaaS. And I think that's where we get into trouble. I think Kubernetes does make it possible to take what we would consider traditional workloads, like something that ran in WebLogic or vSphere or inside of JBoss. Yeah, you can probably package that up in a container and produce a config that will make it run similar to it does on the VM. I think that is true. But to believe that you're going to replace all of your mainframe, all of your kind of one-off things that do weird things, those things will be a bit challenging. But we have to figure out, like, is it okay to have multiple platforms, and then realize that the thing you have that you don't call a platform probably is a platform, and it has an API that means something to someone.
Completely agree.
With larger companies, it's probably not even a question whether it is okay, just the reality of
it's
the
a question.
situation.
It's a question. Trust me. Like, if you think about the number of companies that have innovation teams or modernization teams or modernization efforts, you typically hear this vision. And you're right, maybe there are other discussions where they know that this is just going to be an additional platform, but the way it's usually articulated, as if this thing is going to be the future of the company, as if it's going to not also suffer from issues that the other platforms before it have suffered. So I think a lot of times, people just go all in thinking that in 18 months, this is going to be the new gold standard for the business, versus, like when we hear journey, it's like, where are you going? Usually when you go on a journey, you want to have a destination. And I think for most people, we're learning, and there's no end to the learning part. And that's where I think a lot of people struggle. They believe that there's a deadline, like, oh, I'm going to learn Kubernetes by Q2, and then by Q3, we'll be running in production. It's like, that's not really how learning works, right? You need some experience. And once you get to production, you're going to get a whole new set of experiences that's going to augment your education. We have to start thinking about pacing ourselves based on, learning over time.
I agree.
Now shall we launch a poll and see what other people think or experience with challenges? So I'll do that now. And let's give it a minute or two. Then we can talk about. So.
Can I check all these? Can I participate? It says I can't vote.
I can't do anything.
Check them all.
Kelsey, if you check, we are just at the beginning of our Kubernetes journey. I will lose a lot of respect.
I'm gonna click that one. You don't know my pain. I might be at the beginning of my Kubernetes journey.
And what's the next component that you're gonna do the hard way? Because you did Kubernetes, you were working on something else. What's the next hard way that you're gonna do?
I actually have it finished, and I'm debating about publishing. So I finished it last year, called Service Mesh the Hard Way. And I spent a long time writing Istio configs by hand, basically replicating everything that Istio does by hand. Jot tokens. I even wrote a Jot implementation in Golang, like really the hard way. Look at the RFC, look at some of the other implementations. I have a Jot server that does exchange tokens. So that way in your Envoy config, you can exchange the token for a scope token. And then I hooked up Open Policy Agent so that you can do Auth-Z. So I did the whole thing, including metrics, got Prometheus in there. I'm doing some tracing, and I'm just doing everything from scratch, even generating the trace IDs, the whole nine. And I looked at it, it's super complex. It's actually more work than Kubernetes the hard way.
Makes sense.
The service mesh has more layers and components than Kubernetes does. And so I looked at that and just like, whoo, this is going to be a hard one to maintain. So I might publish it, but it definitely goes into, because I had a question. So the reason why I stopped, I had a question and I went on Twitter. And the way I implemented is I wrote a bunch of microservices as the test bed. And I noticed that I kept making the decision. Do I put the security check in the Envoy or do I put it in the app? And if I put it in the app, then Envoy can't stop things coming to me first. And I have to rely on every app in every language to do the right thing. If I put it in Envoy, then I found myself wanting to duplicate the same Auth-Z checks in the app because I didn't want to blindly trust some token that's coming in that may not have been minted by the upstream consumer. So asking people on Twitter is like, most people are like, yeah, at some point you may have to trust the thing above you is doing the right thing. And until I come up with a good solution for that, I don't know if that's the right way. So maybe I'll publish that as part of the thoughts.
Yeah, an evolving thing, probably.
Okay, so we got the results. Let me actually share those results. I hope that everybody can see it now.
Yeah.
So what do you guys think?
The
Kelsey,
biggest one there.
or Bruno. Okay, go.
No, I think those the two that get voted the most, I'd say we want to abstract developers away from Kube as well as from an application layer. I think that's the biggest bulk of what we're gonna show today and get Kelsey's opinion on that as well. So it's good to see, at least from my perspective.
Yeah, so there's no surprises here because if we did this poll 10 years ago, instead of kubectl, it would be SSH and virtual machines. Instead of we are looking for an application level abstraction, people will be say, hey, we're trying to evaluate Heroku versus Cloud Foundry instead of just, infrastructure as a service. So I think the same problems remain, is that we're getting to the point where it's easier to build these abstractions. So I think there are a lot of people who are trying to build their own platform. So I can imagine they all went through these phases. And then you get to the point where, you know what, let's just roll the pass, right? Like Pivotal could do it. Shippa could do it. We can do it. We got 3 people on the team. Why not?
That's how they start. And one of the last few folks that I was talking to, they are at 25 people right now building it and still not there. So yeah, it's tough, man.
All right, let's get into it.
Yeah.
It's possible that companies need to actually try it, fail it, and then understand how to appreciate getting something.
Yeah, if you don't quit first, there's some people that are just out. But you're right. People go through this cycle of build versus buy. And I think we got to just be honest with ourselves. What are you building? Because you're not building it just for today. You have to build it for 10 or 15 years. Yeah. And I think that's the hidden cost of building any platform. Because I think a lot of people do have the skills to actually do a good job. Just for people that are listening, you do probably have the skills. It's the will power is that question. In year 5, do you still want to be maintaining a pass that's only used by your company? That's the harder thing for an engineer to come to the realization of, do I really want to be doing this for 5 years in a row? And also, can I compete with everything else that's going on in the world long term? So I think just a healthy question to ask.
And and another question to ask as well, and as we get into kind of showing Shippa is, does it make sense for you as a business to do it, right? Because a lot of effort goes into that, a lot of resources go into that. So it's not only one team or one platform or one platform that you have to sustain, right? You have many apps, you have many different requirements. So going through those and building and supporting those, it's tough. And one of the things that I tell many customers is everyone wants to believe that you are unique, right? So you're building your own thing because you're unique, and everyone is special and unique in their own ways. But if you just raise your head a little bit, you're gonna see that probably 80% of the stuff you do is 80% of the stuff that everybody does, right? So is it easier for you to have something that helps you achieve those 80% as a quick win for your team, but it's scalable and customizable that you can build the other 20% on top of it to attend your uniqueness, right?
Well,
Maybe-
it's up to platforms like Shippa. If you can really do 80% of the things I need you to do, and then allow me to extend the other 20% that you don't, then we might be on the way to a solution. I think that's been the biggest problem. Most platforms haven't allowed people to break the glass to do things that it can't do. And I think that's just the thing that even on the provider side, we have to come to terms with. Without that break glass, you're forcing people to jump between platforms or just go and build their own if it's going to be so much overhead in doing workarounds.
I agree.
So Bruno, shall we go through Shippa now that you mentioned it at least 20 times? What is it?
Yeah, and I think there's a question here that we should maybe when we start showing off Shippa. So there's a question here. Is this useful for a starter with Docker or not? I mean, the level for this webinar. So I think I'm going to try to represent someone coming from the Docker world as a beginner, because if you've used Docker for the very first time, and you may be familiar with that concept of like building, packaging your app and storing it into some repository. At that particular moment, you have a couple of choices. Number one, install Docker everywhere on all of your virtual machines. And of course, you can write some scripts, and there's lots of platforms that will essentially go through each of those machines and start pulling images and managing it for you, right? You can even just use the Docker command. That's how a lot of people get started. If you're looking at this from that lens, as someone that's just new to containers, new to Docker, you got to step back and say, once I've created that container image and I put it in the repository, now where you can go, right? It's like when you package a Christmas present or something, you can ship it with any set of shippers, UPS, FedEx, DHL, all those become options because you put it in the box. So that container gives you options. You can go to Heroku, you can go to Cloud Run. And I think today what we're talking about is Shippa, right? Shippa is saying, do you want to skip all the middle layers and take on their workflows for that container image that you've used to build with Docker? So I would say if you're new, pay attention and ask yourself, is this the right area that I should be looking at?
Makes sense. That's an awesome answer.
So Bruno, Shippa was just compared to UPS.
I don't know. That's a good question. UPS or FedEx, it's a good comparison, I think. And I think a good segue into that is I think you folks can see my screen now probably.
Yep.
But one of the I think a good segue into that is the day one, right? I have my application and I want to deploy it as a developer, right? How do I get this thing up and running? And that's a very common question that we see, or topics that we see out there when we're talking to different enterprises. And as we mentioned before, one of the ways to do it, or I think one of the most used ways today is Helm, right? And just like in nature, what we see people doing is you don't create anything from scratch. You basically copy the Helm chart from someone and you start changing it. And as a developer, I say that the experience is okay. When you start kind of going through what you copied, you look at chart.yaml file, and I'm using an application called DevOps Toolkit from Viktor. You look at it and you're like, okay, I have 3-4 fields. I'm smart enough. I can change those fields, right? It's just a version and a description. And as you start looking at these things for the first time, we're like, okay, the values. I see some limits here. I don't know how much to put it here. It's like Kelsey said, as long as there's memory and CPU available, let's just use it all. I'll put it all there. So, and as you start looking into the templates folder, You're like, okay, now I have a deployment YAML. And as a developer, from an experience perspective, you start going through these things and you're like, well, okay, what's a match label selector, right? What is a liveness probe for Kubernetes? How do I use this thing and how does that relate to my app? And as you start going down, you start seeing Istio. How do I configure Istio as a developer, right? How do I expose my application? So that's where we see a lot of people kind of from a development perspective on day one, they are stuck right now. This is
and Bruno, go back one really quickly. So I think
Yeah.
this is important for people to understand. If you look at all the YAMLs, I think this is the beauty of Kubernetes, is kind of the gift and the curse. All of those objects that were in that directory, you saw Istio, which allows you to manage your networking. If you're using things like service mesh, maybe you want things like rate limiting or some type of encryption. There's lots of stuff you can do in the networking, and then Istio will be your config file. If you want to horizontally scale your application, that HPA.YAML will allow you to kind of articulate how it should scale and what metrics it's used to scale. But if you notice, it takes about 2, 4, 6, 8 of these, YAML files to articulate that. And of course, without a templating engine like Helm, you would have to copy these for every app and maybe even every environment if you're not using something that can replace variables. So for some people, Helm is the first, if you want to call it that, almost like a platform as a service, because once you abstract away these low-level YAML files, and then you go up to the top of this directory and you see the fact that all you have to do is give it a set of values, assuming you know what those values are and what they mean, then Helm takes those and generates all of these underlying things. So a lot of people that are using Helm may have this feeling that Helm plus Kubernetes feels like a PaaS because you get most of the benefits of a PaaS by having the ability to abstract away your app behind an API. But I think that's not enough. And I think that's kind of what you're hinting at.
That's right. And we see a lot of folks complaining, saying, we start with Helm, it goes well at the beginning, but as you start scaling, now we have to build the controls around what people are using with Helm, and it becomes hard at scale with different requirements, different teams, different clusters, and you get complex to manage. And at the end of the day, the developers, they don't even like dealing with that stuff. So I think it's a very good stepping stone to start. But we're seeing folks as they scale, they start having problems with that level of, I would say, complexity or details, because again, 80% of the time, you don't need all of that.
What's that commit? What does Argo rollout mean here? I think someone's asking a quick question. Is that just something you did?
I can answer that one. Yes, that's in case you want to use Argo rollouts to progressive delivery. I think it's Canary deployments using analysis based on few metrics from Prometheus.
Yeah, so that's that whole continuation of, if you haven't used Argo before, it's kind of like a CI/CD system, pretty advanced actually, but it can also be configured through YAML files. And in this case, the types are rollout. And so what he's done here is he's also co-located those configurations, even for the pipeline and the app and the service mesh are all together and wrapped into one object or abstraction that Helm can use. So developer may not need to know everything about Argo CD and what a rollout even means, but this template is hiding that. So what you're seeing here basically is a collection of all of the things that it takes to roll out an application, including using things like Argo to do it.
Mm-hmm.
That's one of the problems, I believe, with let's say having operators or sysadmins trying to enable others in a company to use Helm, because over time you need to include ever increasing number of permutations, right? People defining their applications in a simpler way, they have to be able to use canary deployments, and then you have yet another file with an if-else statement, and somebody else might need this, somebody else might need that, right? And that complexity and the number of permutations is increasing over time, and making it very hard to manage. Because
yeah, so I would say, Bruno, pivot back to the Shippa thing. So I think once you get to Helm, now you're in the PaaS business, whether you know it or not.
Yeah,
you're now in the PaaS business. Kubernetes gives you about 50% of what you need, maybe 60. Helms gives you a way to wrap a bunch of components together.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And then now you're like, hey, maybe now developers should just write a lot of Helm charts. I'll maintain Helm charts. And you're at the foundations of a PaaS. If you squint, that is your PaaS. And it has a bunch of features. It's ad hoc. You've made it yourself. You can extend it in certain ways. Now, if you change it a lot, just know that you're going to go through and have to refactor a bunch of Helm charts. Yeah. And hopefully they're compatible in some way. And so I guess given the sake of time, maybe we jump over to Shippa to show like, hey, this is the Helm method. What is the Shippa method for doing something similar?
Exactly. So that's the Helm chart for the DevOps toolkit, right? Which is gonna basically deploy your image, give an access point to your application to run. So if we look from a Shipa perspective, that's the Shipa dashboard, and Shipa can be operated from a dashboard, as well as from the CLI or from your CI pipeline, for example. But for the sake of simplicity, let's say I want to deploy the exact same DevOps toolkit application, right? I'm a developer, I have my Helm, but now I'm switching over to Shipa. So if I come in here and I say, hey, I'm going to deploy an application called DevOps Toolkit, I'm going to deploy into what Shipa calls a framework, and I'll tie this up maybe into a second part of the conversation, which is how to implement some governance and controls into what's being deployed by the developers. And who is the owner of the app? Let's say I'm part of multiple teams, so I can choose which team is the owner of the app.
Now, when the first time I saw the framework thing, I would admit the name is a little confusing for me, but to me, framework felt like a deploy target, meaning whatever cluster namespace, whatever rules you want to have, it felt like you bake that into the framework. So as a developer, you know that once you select this framework, it's going to go to the right place. You don't need to think about that a second time.
That's right. Me as a developer, I don't have to worry about what cluster version I'm using, what's the cluster provider, and what are the objects and manifests that I need to put together. The frameworks are enforced by by my DevOps or platform engineering team on the rules, and they define. So me as a developer, I just select it as a target, and my application will be deployed. And happy to go through kind of the workflow around setting up a framework and some of the definitions that you can put there as governance as well. But let's say I created my DevOps Toolkit app, and I go in here. One of the things that we see a lot of folks complaining is that once I create my services or I start deploying my app, Kubernetes can become like a black box because it becomes those living objects in the cluster. I don't know how to identify and relate them directly to my app. It takes time to identify things. So some of the things we're going to see here, but first step is how do I deploy my app? So I see Viktor has an image here already built. So I'm just going to come and I'll deploy this image directly from here. Again, what I'm doing from the dashboard can be done from the CLI or can be done from a CI pipeline. It's all about the permission that you set.
Now, while you're doing that, we have some good questions come out. Like, I think this is a really good one, which is, look, as a developer, I expect to see Django, Express, Spring Cloud there. Maybe a better term needs to be introduced. And then when I first see that, I'm like, I think what we assume in the Kubernetes world is that in the container, you have Express, Django, all of those things is where you basically encapsulate the platform from knowing anything about the needs of Express versus Django. All that comes in the application container. And then what you're deploying is an app, regardless of how it's built. And so even if framework isn't the right name, it's more of deploy my application to this target. What would you say about that? Is that spot on?
That is spot on. I mean, the application being a Node.js app or being a Django app, for example, those are the definitions that, like you said, you usually package it inside your container. And that's probably part of your CI pipeline, right? It's building your container, running all the tests that you need. And then the framework is just the target that is going to help you get that application deployed. So that's a spot on as an answer.
We have another one. Does Shippa works on Helm charts under the hood and provides the user base to click and deploy functionality?
It does leverage some of the libraries, but doesn't depend exclusively on Helm chart. But we do leverage some of those to identify the clusters that you have and the targets under that framework and be able to automatically create all the manifests and deploy that for you.
So
I
it
guess
sounds
you
like
already
they
answered.
are, yeah, it sounds like they want like a menu of things to click and deploy. I mean, maybe they can add some more to the question, but are they thinking like, hey, there'll be like a Prometheus app that's ready to go, so I can click and just fill out a few variables, and then it just deploys that kind of meta application?
So yeah, that's a good point. So a few things that happen overall, right? So when I deploy my DevOps to Kit, again, as a developer, I just passed my image that was built, and Shippa connected to the ingress controller that you have in the cluster, for example. It created you an endpoint for your application that you can access. And I can see the DevOps to Git website already or application already running without knowing Helm or Kubernetes or whatsoever. And directly from here, I can start identifying things such as who is the owner of that application, right? And what are the resources that this application is consuming. And we start driving things down as a workflow for the developer, right? That you start seeing things such as the transactions for my application and the performance. This is leveraging Prometheus on the back end, but we see some folks exporting it to other tools such as Datadog or New Relic, for example, but you can have a quick idea of how your application is performing.
Where are those metrics coming from?
This is coming from your ingress. So this is coming from Istio or traffic in this case, for example, that is in my cluster. And I can see the resource utilization, so how my apps are doing. You can see the units that are deployed as part of your app and the state of those units. If you're using a multi-region cluster, you can see where the units of these application is deployed. You can see things such as a life cycle of your app. So everything that happened, and folks that are in kind of regulated industries, they like this because you can see who created the application, when deployments happen, who did what, the log associated to that action, when the application scaled up or down, and you can see everything that happened directly from here. So it's easy for you to run an audit on each individual app as well.
So it's looking like you're being true to the whole Kubernetes way of doing things, right? Like you have logs. My guess is someone could run a bunch of kubectl commands and stitch together this information, but it looks like you're making an opinionated view, like lifecycle means these things, right? And I guess you're linking all the events into this view.
That is right, exactly. So instead of you having to run a bunch of kubectl and try to understand which object belongs to what and what happens to those, you can quickly see the history of your application and who did what and the log associated to that activity before. You can see the security scans that were executed when this application was deployed, and this is part of the framework definition. And you can see if there are any vulnerabilities identified as part of that.
All right, so you got to explain where the hell does that come from, right? Like, is this just part of the install of Shippa? Is my app having to do anything? Like, how are things showing up here?
So your application doesn't have to do anything. So everything is driven from a framework perspective, the definitions of the framework. And if we go back to the framework is how you as a platform engineering team or DevOps engineering team, you can create and control things. Let me get one that I have here.
Yeah, I think it would be good to maybe walk us through like a high level framework or how to create one or one that's already made. Because to me, like I remember when you guys showed me for the first time, I say, you know what? Like I get paths, I get higher level abstractions, I get better views. But the hardest thing is to abstract people from having to figure out how to create those things, right? Like, how do I decide if I want to use a service mesh or not? What namespaces to deploy, what permissions? And I had someone DM me on Twitter, Kelsey, how the hell do you make RBAC roles in Kubernetes? They've been trying for 2 or 3 days to figure it out. Maybe walk us through frameworks, because it sounds like whether it's a developer or someone on the platform team, they can create frameworks. I'm going to start calling them deploy targets. They can create these kind of infrastructure frameworks or deploy targets. Walk us through creating one and then dive us into one that's already built.
Yep. So for example, when you start creating the framework or defining the framework or deployment target, we try to put it as much as possible in a workflow format, right? If you look at today, if you have to define some of the things such as what is the trusted repository that I want applications to be deployed from, and define things such as label, ingress, and egress, those are very YAML and very infrastructure driven. So when we were putting together the workflow or the framework, we try to think about it from a workflow format. How do you define this, thinking about the app? And directly from here, you're going to see some general information, right? So basically, a framework maps to a namespace in your cluster, where you're going to define the name. You're going to define the ingress controller that you want to use for this framework in case you have different ingress controllers across different clusters. Directly here, you're going to set up what's the plan that you want application. So every application that is deployed pointing to this framework, they're going to automatically get these configurations as the default configuration or security governance, so to say. So you're defining here the plan or how much CPU and memory that your applications are going to automatically receive, and which teams can deploy these.
All right, so before you click on, I think some of the decisions that I'm seeing here is that if a plan, so in Kubernetes without Shippa, I will be creating an emission controller or something to say, if a developer deploys their app without memory and CPU specifications, I might decide that the default value should be half a CPU and 50 megs of RAM.
That's right.
It sounds like when I create these plans, I'm also deciding what those various quotas are, the default decisions. I think in general, you pick the load balancer, traffic. It could have been Envoy, it could have been some other thing.
That's right.
But what I guess what you're saying is that maybe every team isn't going to do everything the same way. One team may prefer Istio. One team might like traffic. One team needs a different set of defaults. So it feels like there's some Helm-like things, but instead of using maybe Helm, you're using the feature in Kubernetes where you can actually take these rules engines. And then when the workload comes in, my guess is you're taking the plan and you're just like, hey, okay, your memory setting is too high. We're going to make adjustments, or it's missing. We're going to fill it in based on the plan.
That's right. And the way we see folks using frameworks, they are using it in different ways. Either from a team perspective, different teams, they assign different frameworks, or they assign maybe on a project base, for example. So different development, QA, and production. So these, they can receive automatically kind of different settings or configuration that you can preset for dev versus production. So you make sure that dev is not sucking up all the memory that you have, or CPU, for example. The teams that can deploy using this target, you can go in and say even how many apps or services you can deploy to this framework. In terms of registry control, you can say everything deployed through this framework can only come from Google Container Registry, for example, in this project. So anything else deployed from Azure or JFrog or whatever gets blocked deployed using this framework.
This is a good policy, by the way. I like that. GCR only. I like that.
Exactly. And by default, you can also say, hey, I'm going to set some default network policies, right? So every time an application gets deployed through this framework, it's going to get a default set of setting of network policies.
All right. So I think I get it now. I can look at some of the other options. So if you ask me, with all my years of experience, when I meet with engineering teams or I do deep dives on platform teams trying to figure this out, they're all trying to figure out, how should we harden our Kubernetes cluster before we start letting people use it? And a lot of things in this framework configuration, wizard that I'm seeing here, and I'm assuming you can probably do this all with like a big YAML config. This framework wizard is saying, these are all the questions that you probably want to think about in a general platform that you're trying to build for your teams. So I can imagine someone saying, even if I didn't use, and I'm guessing here, even if I didn't use Shippa to deploy, I could use this to configure my namespaces and the emission controllers to really get my Kubernetes cluster locked down. Would that be a true statement? Can I actually just configure my namespace and then maybe still use kubectl to deploy normal objects? Would that work?
That works. And the thing is, even so, when you create a framework, Shippa automatically creates a namespace for you in the cluster. But you also have the option, if you already have a namespace, you can point this framework to an existing namespace when you're creating it. So instead of Shippa creating the framework, creating one, you can say, hey, everything that we're applying here applies to existing namespace X, for example. So you can do that as well. And you're tying all things around resource consumption, egress, ingress, security scans, and so on. So you're defining those policies at that level.
So let me make sure I understand though, because the one thing that when I used to be a full-time system administrator or running the platform team, I was always scared of tools like this turning my otherwise open thing into a black box. Mm-hmm. Am I going to be able to see these network policies that are being created? Am I going to be able to see some of these quotas? Where are these things going to be stored so I can examine them, maybe just using standard kubectl tools and commands? Is that going to be possible?
That's a good point. So when you're creating the framework, you're thinking about the application layer level, right? So what are the set of standard governance settings that every application deployed should receive? But the second step after you define the framework is bind it to a cluster. And that's one of the differences where when you think about paths, for example, I'm gonna take a shot at OpenShift, for example. When I'm using OpenShift, I can only deploy the OpenShift clusters here and there. We changed the approach on that. So you can bind these frameworks to GKE or your own premises Kubernetes. You can bind to any cluster that you have available and the namespace in that cluster. So everything that Shippa is defining, if you go back to your cluster and use kubectl, for example, you're going to see the network policies in there. You're going to see, so you can break the glass. And if you need to inject some fault tolerance or something on Istio, for example, you as a DevOps or platform engineer, you own the infrastructure.
So this part looks new because I remember when you showed me this for the first time, it felt like it was a one-to-one, and for every cluster, I would have to do this again or figure out how to copy them around. It sounds like now that the framework is a high-level policy bucket. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And then if I apply it to these clusters, my guess under the hood, you're doing some magical adding a mission controller config so that they point to Shippa so that the things get enforced.
That is right.
And you're dropping the right configs in the right place?
That is right. And you can have as many policies as you want, or frameworks in this case, per cluster. And you can go, that's one example that I use usually deploying kind of a cinema app, that you define a framework for your cinema services and a framework for payment services in the same cluster, but with different security settings, different governance, different users that can deploy and control these services. And you can have as many as possible as you want in your cluster, in a single cluster, for example.
I think we should pivot to some of the questions. There's a really good question that came up, which is, look, many people are trying to build their own paths because they need a solution now, right? They find gaps in solutions like Shippa. And then, of course, they use it in many cases, a valid excuse to build their own solution. So what does it take for a solution like Shippa to come close to that 80, 90% feature parity, right? And I think I've asked you this question before. It's I need something that can be extended. This is cool. And if I take the time to learn all this stuff here, I'm pretty sure I can get pretty far. But let's say it only gets me to 70%. How do I extend the other 30%?
That's a good point. And there are multiple ways you can extend Shippa, right? Shippa can be entirely controlled not only from here, but all the framework definition, binding it to a cluster, application deployment, and so on, can be directly controlled from your CI. You don't need to do anything from here. The other point as well is Shippa has the APIs available and documented. So everything that we are showing here is available. And yes, I use Edge as the browser for now. It's been good. The API reference is available and open, so you can control everything from a Shippa perspective directly from the API. So you can use that as an extension if my internet helps me. There you go. The other thing as well is Shippa has something called plugins, for example. That you can use to define new functionalities around Shippa. So for example, I define one that I plug into Terraform, and I create a new cluster. I deploy a whole set of services. I deploy Shipa frameworks, and I extended it in different ways. So there are really multiple different ways for you to try and extend Shipa to your 80, 90%. 100%, being honest, no single solution can give you 100%. Otherwise, people would use only one stack, right?
And would it be fair to say, like I used to do a lot of networking back in the day, and I remember we used to delegate control of certain ports for different functionality. Like if you're going to connect it to VMware, maybe I give you control of the VLAN that the port is in. So you have this concept of a shared responsibility. It sounds like, and from just me gathering, I could use Shippa in like, let's say 5 namespaces, but I can still use kubectl and the other namespaces, right? Side by side.
You're completely right. So you're completely right. You can use Shipa doesn't take over a cluster. If you tie Shipa to a GKE cluster on a framework called framework 1 or a namespace, Shipa will consume that. But all the other namespaces you control, and you can assign your apps to there if you desire. And even the framework that Shipa creates, if you want to deploy stuff directly there, you are, but then there's sync things, but you own the cluster. Shipa doesn't take over your cluster in any way.
The question from Kostis that I think it's interesting to answer. It says, I assume that in a big company, only operators suddenly see the framework screen and developers only see the application screen. So operators prepare the policy and developers use the policy without having to know all the details. Is that how it goes?
That is perfectly right. Yeah, so that's how we see folks using it. DevOps or platform engineering, they can come into Shipa, register, create an account, define the frameworks, bind to their cluster, and give it access to their developers. All their developers see is their applications being deployed. And after deployment, they can see exactly the objects and the relationships to their apps. So your developers, they have some good level of observability into what's happening, the details, not only from an object perspective, but also the network policies that are being applied by the framework automatically as well.
Yeah, someone asked to see the volumes view. And I think the main thing here is that, of course, volumes are going to be a thing. So if you click on it, my guess is this is going to be a similar output to kubectl get volumes. Right. And my guess is you're going to probably attach those to the thing that's actually consuming the volume.
That is perfectly right. And you are going to see the volume directly here available as well in the object dependency. So you can see the volume and the volume claim. You can see the status of the volume as well as the details, for example, for it. If you go directly on Kube and you do get PVC or get PV, you're going to see that information directly there as well.
There's another good question around. So this one comes up a lot. I see a lot of people worry about audits, right? So, is it the information around deployment history and updates persisted beyond the history of the cluster? One thing I have found is that the history of deployment goes away. If someone actually deletes a deployment, we lose that history. So I know a lot of companies want those things to be independent. So does Shippa become the system of record for some of these events so that they live longer? I could imagine I would want them to live longer than the cluster's life cycle. I still want that view. Is that something preserved by Shippa?
It is. So Shipa, both on premises and now Shipa Cloud that we're launching, and we have about 200 people pre-registered now to Shipa Cloud. You can come in, everything that you do and use around Shipa Cloud is persisted in the database. So even after you delete the app or you remove the cluster from Shipa, those info are directly available in the database, so you can query them at any point in time. So it persists the data for you.
I'm going to get into this last question that I see here too, because, you talked about Shippa Cloud, and I guess the thing that comes to mind for the first time for me, like hearing about Shippa Cloud, is what gets installed in the cluster, right? If the control plane is hosted by you, are you installing CRDs in my cluster? Are you installing, is there going to be like a Shippa system namespace where there's controllers that understand those CRDs and a mission controller? What actually gets installed there, maybe in the cloud version and the self-hosted version where I install everything in my cluster?
Yeah, so from a Shipa Cloud perspective, when you come in here, you create a framework and you'll bind it to that framework to a cluster. Basically, you're going to see a Shipa namespace in your cluster, and the CRDs are going to be created directly there. And basically, Shippa is gonna leverage those to, one, be able to create and deploy the objects and enforce the rules and governance across in your cluster, as well as start plugging into your existing ingress controller, for example, and getting metrics and so on, and being able to deploy here and give your developer that developer portal that a lot of people are trying to build today. So that's from a Shipa cloud perspective. From a Shipa on-premises perspective, then control plane is in your cluster. Then all the objects from a monitoring policy, admission controller, and everything, those are completely deployed in your cluster. That can, again, be GKE, for example, doesn't need to be in a directly on-premises cluster.
And that's in line with the Kubernetes model of having, if I was using Shippa Cloud, the last thing I want is for Shippa Cloud to be down and my apps not be working or can't be restarted because there's no local cluster state to allow the controllers to do their work. So I can imagine in the Shippa Cloud version, the control plane and the UI may be hosted upstream, maybe even some of the emission controllers, and then the emission config is put inside of the cluster. Is that how you do the split for Shippa Cloud?
Exactly. So even if you take out Shippa entirely, or Shippa goes down, or if you say, well, I don't want Shippa anymore, it plays a different role than platform as a service that, okay, if you want to get out of it, you have to redeploy everything. Your applications, in our case, they will still be running in your cluster. You still have access to everything and you own everything. So that's a different approach as well.
I'm going to go a little faster with this since we only have a few minutes left. But one question that came in that I think is pretty dope is, when you update a framework, does it apply immediately universally across the board? What about things that are mid deployment? So yeah, how does that work, right? You have this underlying level of configuration. And if I go update the framework that's attached to 10 different clusters, and all 10 going to immediately start getting new Istio updates and changes based on the framework?
No, we don't do that, because when you define, for example, a framework, one of the things you can say is, hey, here is the network policy, for example, that I want every app to get, right? But I can allow app level policies to be changed. So after deployment, you can give someone access to come in here into my payment app, for example, or booking, and the person can come in here and change the network policy, assuming they have the permission to do it. So we don't enforce everything from the framework. As soon as you update the framework, we don't enforce everything, because there may be changes. So we map those changes and we show you. So later you can enforce these changes from framework level at the app level, because there may be some
ones will change though. Like if I were to change those base ones, those new policies would essentially take effect immediately, right? Even though I could split things, if I don't split things, it's going to basically be it's going to roll out wherever that framework is being used, right?
Exactly. If they are not different, let's say, like I mentioned here, if you change the network, but if they comply with the framework, those changes are going to be rolled out.
Got it. Yeah, that one's going to be careful when y'all do that, right? Because some people do make mistakes when they do that. I can imagine someone wanting the ability to version frameworks, like framework version v100, apply it to one cluster, wait a while, and then have it roll out to the other. So maybe that's some feedback that if frameworks were versions, because when I used to work at Puppet Labs, we had the same type of concerns for underlying modules, Puppet modules, right? Like if you didn't version those things, you could actually just roll them out by mistake because it was a dependency of something else. So one team needed a framework update, but the other teams didn't. But they all have to take the framework update at the same time. So I think that would be a cool thing if it isn't there already. I'm gonna jump into the next question. I think I know this person, Kyle. Is there a concept of all this config being linked back to a Git repo, for example, similar to like a GitOps approach? If someone wants to change a cluster via, like kubectl or via the UPI, is there any concept of remediation? Think linkage and the open policy agent approach. So I guess if I'm clicking around this UI, creating frameworks, deploying apps, where's the source of truth? Is that just all inside of this, database, or is there a way to serialize all the objects?
So everything that you were creating here, let me CI frame template. So all the framework that you're creating, all the clusters that you're binding to, and everything that you're doing, these can be config files that you can store in Git and have all these be deployed directly from Git. So the only reason why I'm showing this from the UI is that you get the perspective exactly of what's happening. But
in the UI
Shipa
though, are you creating objects that I could export into a repo later, right? If I'm only using the UI, are these things being generated in the background?
Yeah. So for example, if you go and create a framework directly in the UI, you can do a framework config export for that framework, and it generates you the config file that you can just tie to Git, for example.
Got it. Got it. All right, we're going to take a few more. I know we're almost out of time, so let's just grab two really quickly. Oh, this is a good one. Can you import existing apps in your K8s cluster into Shippa?
Yeah, that's an easy import. If you have, for example, the image already being built by your CI pipeline, which I guess it may be, you can do exactly like we did for the DevOps toolkit.
I'm gonna go on a guess and say maybe the guess here is that if I already created a deployment object, did kubectl apply? Is there a way for Shippa to take that deployment object and just consume it?
That is being rolled out to Shipa Cloud by end of month, actually, that you can just link to your existing namespace. It's going to show all the apps that you have running, and you can choose which ones to import into Shipa. And Shipa will show, based on the framework, which existing apps comply with the framework and does not comply with the framework. So
and I'm assuming that's going to convert a standard Kubernetes deployment object into a Shippa application object?
That is right.
Got it. Got it. All right. So I'll say this is the last one we should probably do. And it seems like we got a lot of good questions. You know, how does this integrate with CI/CD pipelines? I think you talked about it. And to me, I saw frameworks as creating the last mile. Once you create a framework with all the rules, policies, quotas, the whole nine, in my mind, the framework becomes a deploy target. And the way I think about CI/CD is once you have a good deploy target, my guess is you would go and use the Shippa command line tool or API to say, hey, here's a Shippa object, and I want you to apply it to this framework. Is that how it works at a high level, or maybe give us a little detail there?
That is perfect. I think you're explaining it well. You explain better. We're looking for engineers, Kelsey, if you're looking for a new role.
If I need a new job, I'll call you.
But you're exactly right. So here, for example, I'm using GitHub Actions. It basically pulls my code, does whatever adjustment I need and test. It builds the image, sends it to Google Container Registry. And then down here, it's deploying the app. And it's just pointing the app, Shipa deploy app, name of the app in this case, because the app is already tied to the framework. And I'm running a deployment of this image from GCR. And in this case, I'm running a canary deployment. So you can tie this up in different ways, but that's an example of tying Shipa to your CI pipeline in this case.
Yeah, as we wrap up, to me, I think even though we talk about paths, I think we're all trying to build the deploy target. And Kubernetes, even though I talk about the problems of kube, it is a pretty good deploy target. kubectl apply, a bunch of YAML files, and then your app is running. And I think everyone's trying to make a simpler deploy target by wrapping the rules, what we call emission hooks. And there's so many tools Kubernetes gives you to create a better deployment target, but you have to know each of those independently. And typically you have to build most of those emission controllers yourself and put them all together and wrap it behind a common config. That's like the pattern we're seeing. I think what Shippa does, and you guys correct me if I'm wrong, it takes somewhat of an opinionated view on leveraging all of Kubernetes kind of, knobs and configuration and policy engines and saying, here's a framework, I'm talking the whole product, Shippa, for creating deploy targets based on policies by leveraging standard Kubernetes ways of doing things. And then for your developers, yeah, they can always learn Kubernetes, and of course they can always break glass. But for them, they're going to be talking more about the Shippa API that is using those wrapped up platform-like deploy targets.
That's perfectly right. Yeah, I agree. And that way, you pivot the DevOps team to focusing on that governance, and you still have control of your cluster. You choose GKE, you choose the version, you control it's your infrastructure. But now you choose the frameworks that you want and the governance and the policies, and you have a quick win with your developers, because what we see constantly is that the DevOps or the platform engineering team, they're trying, like you said, they're trying to deliver something for the developers to get away from Cube and focus on the app. So while we still give you control of everything, which is a different approach than kind of at the traditional path, you focus on that quick win, you define the governance, you define the policy, DevOps are in control, but developers, they are deploying their applications now. They focus back on the app rather than on the infrastructure. So
And I think if people look at this, I think the thing to be careful is if let's say you have a third party thing you're using and it ships as a Helm chart, it sounds like it will still be a good idea just to do kubectl apply Helm chart and let that run in its own namespace, and it will expose its own network connectivity, whether that's an ingress or a service. And your developers may be using Shippa to manage their app. And I think if we avoid the one tool for everything, you'll find that Kubernetes as a base platform is that extendable thing to allow you to run a lot of your workloads. Yep. And where you need more opinionated workflows, something more developer friendly, something more like that Heroku experience that can be customized the Kubernetes way, then maybe Shippa manages those namespaces. And I think that might be the right way to look at this. Not one tool for everything, but boy, is it a good tool for the things it's good at.
I agree. And you can deploy, for example, a Postgres or MySQL in your cluster, which can be managed directly from Helm and so on. Again, you own the cluster, Shippa doesn't take over. And your developers, they can use Shippa to deploy the apps, and they can load a config map, for example, or inject secrets and connect to that database that you have. So now you have your cluster, you're running your applications the best possible way, instead of, like you mentioned, one single way for everything, which doesn't work.
Awesome. Well, I'm down. I'm out of questions, but hopefully a lot of people got a lot out of that. I did learn a little bit more about the implementation details of Shippa, so that's dope. And I'm going to test out the Shippa Cloud to see if it's as easy as you claim.
Yeah, Shippa Cloud is making, today we're making Shippa Cloud available. There are a couple hundred people already pre-registered. Later today, you're gonna see the sign up link already open in our website. So if you have not signed up and you're watching it and you wanna go and play around with that, this afternoon links are gonna be available, and everyone who registered and attended today are gonna get an email as well with more information about it.